All right, folks, welcome to Procreate. So, we're going to go through and we're going to take a look at the Brush Studio in Procreate. Now, the Brush Studio is one of the things that makes Procreate a popular choice with creators. I got to tell you that the artists that I talk to, based on their style of work, you will probably use no more than 3 or 4 brushes that are your go-tos. I've got people in my Facebook group that do a lot of dog portraits. And so if you're doing animal portraits, they tend to do them a little more softly. So they have 4 or 5 brushes that they go to do hair and soft rendering. I've got some people that do a more traditional painterly look, and so they're going to go through and use the heavy acrylics. Got a couple people that do watercolor. I personally do illustration, t-shirts, that sort of thing. And so for me, you guys have already seen through this class that I use traditionally the studio pen. I'm going to use the round brush, and I'm going to use the soft airbrush 99% of the time, some combination of those 3. So I'm not going to cover every single setting in every single area. I'm going to give you the general nickel tour. It's up to you to determine, based on your particular type of art, which brushes are going to be your favorite. All right, so to find the Brush Studio, you can either create a new brush simply by coming up here and hitting the plus button, and now you're off and running. Or you can come up, let's say that I want to take this brush, which is in the painting category, and I wanted to duplicate it and modify it. Slide over, hit duplicate, and now my best piece of advice for you, you remember how we created this Procreate course brush set? I like to keep my categories pure, so I'll go ahead and move this into my other category here. I don't like to modify inside of the default categories of Procreate. It's just my rule. Now, when we do this part, let's just go ahead and modify this brush. When we go over to the Brush Studio, the first thing that I want to show you, I've covered it before, you can clear the drawing pad, and this gives you your practice area. Now, this thing is set up into 3 areas. On the far left are the attributes. In the middle column are what are called the properties, and then you've got the drawing pad. So I'm going to take you on the nickel tour. This is going to be 10 minutes max. The first thing that I do when I set up is I adjust the spacing. Now you see nothing's happening? That's because you got to draw, right? Now you see how that looks like hot trash? Watch what happens as you minimize the spacing. What the spacing does, it takes your shape. You remember how every brush has a shape? And it limits the spacing in between. So if you want a really good smooth line, just crank that bad boy down to 0. Streamline, we already covered. This minimizes hand shaking. Now jitter is interesting. You see that the shape here is kind of a rectangular shape. If you go to jitter and you start moving it, you see how it spreads out along the line? So jitter is a nice way when you're working with spray paint brushes, let's say, to get that to work. Now, this one's always interesting to me, fall off. This stroke that I'm currently doing right now, I can go on indefinitely, but now watch what happens when I adjust fall off. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to put this stroke down. Fall off says I'm going to start strong, and then I'm going to run out of paint. So now if I make a stroke, look at that. And if I adjust the fall off even further, boy, I'll run out of paint after so many strokes here, right after like an inch. So that's the stroke path. Taper, we covered in an earlier lesson. Let's go ahead and clear drawing pad. Oh, got to adjust the fall off back. Clear drawing pad. Stroke path, take that fall off down, or else the rest of this is not going to be very interesting. Now, I like to set the taper on my art. I tend to do a lot of taper. Now, when you have link tip sizes, what does that mean? When you click on this, that means that the beginning will be the same width as the end. So, the link tip sizes allows the beginning to match the end, and I like to turn my taper all the way up, And if you're not going to use an Apple Pencil, this is where Touch Taper comes in. It allows you to taper by using your finger. I don't really set this. I thought about doing it in the lining brushes that we made. Sometimes I will, but I'm always drawing with the Apple Pencil, so for me, this doesn't matter. All right, now let's take a look at shape. We already covered this in an earlier lesson, but shape in reality is think of it like, well, the shape of the brush. The brush is composed of shape and grain, and as you know, because we've made a couple brushes, you can import different shapes, and they have this magical source library. So if I wanted to totally ruin this brush, let's say, I could make it a circle, hit done, and now, you see how now your brush is circular. You change the shape. Now, because it's only got one shape, rotation won't matter, right? This is rotation of the shape. The count is the number of stamps. The count to jitter is how much they vary. And then you can flip the X, Y. About the only one that I do routinely. Sometimes I will make this more of an oval shape. And this is, as we were talking about, to get that really nice type of brush look. Okay? So, there's a lot of stuff here that you can do. And the other side of that conversation is the grain. Now, when it comes to the grain, you can either use a moving grain, which I heard described once, and it was actually brilliant, as think of it like a paint roller, right? The grain isn't stamped on the wall. You drag it across the wall, or you can create what's called a texturized grain. And now notice what changes. Moving, watch the line on the side, textured. Moving, textured. This means as I draw my line, the grain isn't moving, I'm just kind of exposing it. The way that I like to think about this, think of it like a mask layer, right? When you do a mask, you're just exposing the grain, so the grain isn't moving, it's staying stagnant. I don't usually set blend modes on my brushes, but you see this original one was set to multiply. So if I have multiple strokes, it will mirror a multiplied blend mode. And when it comes to filtering, this is just a way that it actually renders the grain and kind of filters it out so that you've got what's called anti-aliasing. And that's that little halo ghost of red, green, and blue that sometimes appears on the side. This is all software stuff. You don't have to worry about the filtering for the most part. Now, when it comes to rendering, rendering is how it lays down on the page. So, think of it like this, and this actually comes directly from the Procreate site. I really liked this description. Light glaze is like a fine watercolor. Intense blending is like a heavy acrylic. Now watch this. You see on the sides how that changes a little bit? Watch what happens when I hit intense blending. See how these strokes now show up? Watch the one I just made. Light glaze, intense blending. So, if you use intense blending, it's going to give you a very dynamic type of color. And if you wet the edges, let's go ahead and turn that up. When you wet the edges and you move multiple strokes, you won't get really hard edges. But if you decide to do what is called burn the edges, now those edges are going to become hard. And in some brushes, you're going to be able at that point then to see a very firm edge. Alright. Wet mix. This is, if you're doing watercolor brushes and such, you can dilute the paint. Charge is the amount of material that's put on to begin with. And the attack is how much is left on the paper as it drops down. A heavy attack rate will be a very heavy glop on the page. Color dynamics. If you wanted to change the hue, saturation, lightness of your brush, you can do that here. I can tell you that for what I do, I don't use this at all. So there are probably a lot more people more highly qualified in your specialty of art that will tell you how to adjust your brush if you wanted to use color dynamics. When I put a color on the brush, I don't want it to be dynamic. I want it to be what I expect. Now let's talk brush dynamics at all. You can adjust the size of the brush based on speed. You can adjust the opacity of the brush based on speed. And then, based on jitter, you can adjust the size and opacity. These two with jitter, again, I don't use because I want it to be repeatable and predictable in the illustrations that I do. But depending on what I'm doing with my hand, I definitely do want, sometimes I want my speed to influence the size and the stroke. So a lot of times for size and opacity, I will set some dynamic around speed. Apple Pencil. I'll tell you what, as a traditional artist, somebody that started in graphite, I don't really use this a lot, all right? I'll turn up the size based on pressure, but that's really about it. I don't use any of the tilt functions. See, now I'm really narrowing out that pressure. Little pressure, lot of pressure. So play with the Apple Pencil. These control how the Apple Pencil works with Procreate. The only one that I use, as I said, is size. Other than that, I don't mess with flow, bleeding, smoothing, any of that, and I don't mess with tilt. This one I do use a lot though. You can use the stamp preview to see your brush. You can make sure that it orients to the way the screen is. The one that I do mess with smudge to make it smudgeable. And I do mess with maximum and minimum size. Now watch this. If you creep down maximum size, you see what that does? And again, I'm an illustrator, so to me, as an inker, I really want to make sure my size is predictable. So even if I press real hard, it will never get beyond that size. This is usually good, but sometimes you're working on large projects and you want to adjust this. So this is where you adjust it. And the last one about this brush, all right, you can go through, rename the brush if you want up there. And if you're messing with that brush daily, you can create a new reset point. Okay? That's a little bit on the brush categories. I'm going to go ahead, right swipe here, and delete this out of our set because we didn't make anything that was necessarily appreciable. And we're going to go ahead and get into the next one. The brush panel is one of those things you're just going to have to mess with. Find your style of art. Find the 3 brushes that you like to begin with, and then modify them from there before almost creating your own. All right, let's go ahead and get into the next lesson.